Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is episode 70, and my guest today is Stacie Williams. Stacie is the director of the new Center for Digital Scholarship at the University of Chicago. She formerly managed the Digital Scholarship Program at Case Western Reserve University's Kelvin Smith Library. Stacie is an advisory archivist for a People's Archive of Police Violence in Cleveland and has worked at Harvard University, the University of Kentucky, and the Lexington Public Library in Kentucky. She is also an essayist whose work has appeared in Bitch Magazine, Lit Hub, New York Magazine, Catapult, Gordon Square Review, and The Rumpus. Stacie's first biblio-memoir, which is focused on gentrification and race, is forthcoming in October 2008 as part of Fiction Advocates Afterwards series. In our interview, Stacie and I talk about how knowledge and information gathering has always been deeply racialized and gendered, the radical work that librarians and archivists are doing to end sexual violence as well as the carceral state, why digitizing everything might actually be a terrible idea with huge environmental consequences, and how radical versions of love are key to how Stacie imagines otherwise. So thank you so much for being with us, Stacie.
Thank you so much for having me, Cathy.
So I'd love to dive into your badass work as a digital content strategist, librarian, archivist, all-around awesome human. And I'm curious, what got you interested in libraries and digital preservation?
There's a bunch of answers to that. I did not start out as a librarian. I was a journalist for about 10 years. And during the recession, I started thinking that perhaps maybe I needed to identify something else that I could do in case journalism, was not going to allow me to have maybe the lengthier career that I hoped that I would have. And so librarianship came up really organically. I mean, I was just like looking at the skill sets, and I am someone who had always spent a lot of time in libraries. My mother took me to the libraries all the time. I really enjoyed being in the library space. So it just felt like a really great way to tap into this thing that I really, really loved to do, but also still help people kind of in the way that I felt like, or that I hoped I was helping people through journalism. Now, with digital preservation, it's more an organic outgrowth of just the things that you have to do in the day-to-day. If you're working as a librarian or if you're working as an archivist, we're working in, born digital spaces with born digital content. And even the things that aren't born digital, we are, where we have like funds or human resources available, making an attempt to digitize those things. So, in terms of just needing to kind of like know that just to get through the day-to-day of my job, I guess that's how I became interested in it. But the aspect of digital preservation that I'm actually the most interested in is what we're doing with the actual resources or tools that allow us to preserve digital objects, and what those materials or what those resources do to like our environments or our communities. So maybe, I might be on the different side of a fence with digital preservation in that I'm someone who actually feels like we should be doing it in a really limited kind of way, because the footprint of it is so large in terms of what it takes up in resources, what it does to our environment, what it demands of the people who are actually doing that labor, and the overall like unwillingness to fund that from a larger societal or cultural perspective. So I'm interested in digital preservation, but maybe not in the same way that some of my peers might be.
That's a really interesting take on this field that we often hear about as just universally championed, right? Like it's just universally good. Of course, everything should be digitized. Like it almost goes without saying. It's just an assumption.
Right. And it is. That is the assumption. And I'm certain I thought that at the start of my career as a librarian. if you're actually paying attention in the day to day, you know that this work extracts a huge cost in a bunch of different areas. So if I look at librarianship as wanting to help people, wanting to be in service, and not just help people, but that you are actively and intentionally trying to make a positive impact, then I have to kind of cast a side eye at digitization. I have to cast a side eye at digital preservation and understand a bit more about it so that, you know, I'm trying to look at ways that we can do it responsibly.
I'm curious what you see some of the big challenges facing this field in the coming years. I mean, you've mentioned some ones already in terms of environmental impact and labor impact of digitization, but are there other issues that you kind of see coming down the pike that you're excited or maybe wary, I don't know, of sinking your teeth into?
Sure. I mean, I think that there are a lot of really exciting things happening right now. One of the things that I'm most excited about, especially when it comes to like archiving or preservation of cultural heritage materials, is the increase of community archiving projects, and specifically with this post-custodial model. So I guess for anybody listening who is not familiar with that term, just this idea that, you know, as archivists, especially if you're in like an academic institution, that we don't always have to be the ones to just take from communities, that we could simply function, you know, as advisors or just people willing to assist and give other people the tools that they need to be able to take care of and preserve their own materials in the way that they want to and retain stewardship over those materials. So totally getting rid of this idea that it's about, you know, going into communities or going into organizations and taking things or being gifted things, but you know, really just giving people the tools that they need to push forward. A good friend of mine, Burgess Jules, recently received a pretty exciting grant that really focuses on not just helping out people who are working on community archives projects, but helping them get funds to do that. Because that's kind of another thing. Like I've been part of maybe university or other library initiatives to sort of go out into communities and teach people the basics of archiving. But we, you know, some of those workshops very seldom talk about funds. So you're like, yeah, put everything in an acid-free folder. But we haven't even like told people where they could get acid-free folders from, or how much they cost, or how much does it cost to have Hollinger boxes, or how much does it cost to, you know, be adjusting your HVAC system so that your humidity is on point, or, you know, to have a room that's free of moisture and things of that nature. Like, you know, I think that prior to very recently, we've talked about this with people in these kind of abstract ways or given them just sort of general tips. But this project that Burgess and John Voss are working on is something that, you know, will really take it a step further and show people how to really get the money to make that sustainable. So I think that's really, really exciting. And I think it's the type of thing that, you know, will really allow not just more voices to be heard, and voices that have, you know, traditionally or typically been silenced or underrepresented in our more traditional archives, but, you know, also just allowing people that autonomy and that space to determine how they're sharing, or if they choose to share or not to share. It's just, I think it's a really exciting time for giving people back some of that power.
So you've written quite a lot about the labor of libraries and archiving spaces, and especially the way that is intensely racialized and gendered. And we've had several librarians and archivists on the show over the episodes who have explicitly connected their librarian and archivist practices to social justice movements, much in the vein of your work. I'm thinking we had Polly Thistlethwaite, for example, on here, who was talking about kind of queer librarians getting life-saving medical information to people living with AIDS. Zach McDowell talked about the open access movement. Lauren Miles Smith was talking about kind of archival practices from a queer and feminist perspective. And I'm curious what you see as the role of librarians or archivists in the kind of movements and communities that you're really passionate about.
Absolutely. I think especially right now, this current moment of history that we're living in, the skills that librarians and archivists have could be really, really powerful. I mean, right now we're talking about not just access to information, but what is information in general. And we're at a point, I think, in our history where people are, actively questioning it, and you kind of have to, because you have elected officials like straight up making things up in real time. Or even, in terms of news media, the language and the words that they might use to soften a thing or make opaque a concept. I mean, I don't even know what to think about the linguistic construction of a quote unquote tender age shelter. There are these facilities with, chain link fences and locks on the door, and people are not allowed to come and go. So that sounds like jail to me, and we're putting children in them. So right now, this idea of, this, I think, a real battle happening with what we are doing to information, what we are doing to words. And so I think the skill set of librarians and archivists with regard to research and digging, a really awesome project. I'm on the advisory board of the Digital Library Federation, and some of the members just the other day released this really incredible map that they were working on, and they went to town. They found a bunch of data sets. Librarians were connecting from all over the place. And digital scholarship folks. They were working at Columbia. They were working at universities in Texas near borderlands areas, and they got together and they made it happen. And they created a series of very compelling maps about where ICE facilities are located, because I think being able to visualize the carceral state as it's related to immigration, I think for people is very powerful. So you really understand the scope of what is happening here. It's a good time for those of us who are trying to do that work. I think that one of the challenges is, addressing this idea of libraries as a so-called neutral space. There are a lot of people, even in the profession, who are deeply invested in this idea of libraries as a totally neutral space where we shouldn't, be talking about politics. We shouldn't make things political. There was never any neutrality really in the library space. When books began to be printed, they weren't for everybody. They were for a very small subset of the population. So, as we have had to move forward and evolve, we have to understand that the nature of what we do has always been inherently politicized. So understanding that, acknowledging that, and then, taking that and moving forward in a space where we can actually do good with what we have, intentionally do good. That's really, I think that's really, it's a huge challenge that we're facing, that exists alongside, this idea that we're in these trying times, but librarians and archivists do have this skill set. It's a huge challenge. Maybe it's just that it's a huge challenge on both sides. But I guess I'd like to say that I believe in some of the things that I've seen, and I want to say that there are some really, really incredible people right now doing really important and meaningful and deeply impactful work. And I just try to learn from them, continue learning as much as I can, and trying to conceptualize with other people ways that we can do this work to the benefit of everyone.
So we've kind of talked around this issue, but I wonder if we can dive a little bit deeper into this question of how you conceptualize the work that you do as combining or maybe bringing together academic interests with your interest in creativity or art and social justice activism.
That is a really great question. Maybe I've tried to define it before, but it also feels like perhaps I've just been operating this way for a while. And I don't mean that to say is that I just, that the whole of my life that I've just been this super woke person. I mean, many things that I thought about with regard to social justice. I mean, they've been evolving for a very, very long time. But, so growing up, I had parents who absolutely encouraged the creativity of their children. So we had exposure to the arts constantly. I did a lot of writing. My parents encouraged me to do a lot of writing. I love reading, and I love just thinking about the different ways that we tell stories. So I suppose that plays into my belief or my understanding that, working with archives, for instance, is just another way that we tell stories. We have gathered these materials and said, okay, people, researchers, general public, what have you, come to this institution and use these resources, and, you'll be able to tell these stories. But, the materials that we've gathered over a period of time, the stories that those sometimes told were very narrow, or you had to look a lot deeper to find some of the deeper stories beyond that. So I've looked at this as a way to help people tell stories. And I think also, having been a journalist, I just feel like there's so many similar things happening between the two fields. I'm probably constantly trying to merge those ideas. So some of the early digital scholarship projects that I did were done on what were essentially like news or long reads platforms, and utilizing some of these same sort of storytelling techniques that journalists would use. And to the extent that I've tried, and I've definitely worked with people who have tried to actively and intentionally engage activist spaces for either the purposes of helping disseminate information to them or opening up room for them to come in our spaces and share their stories and talk about their experiences using library resources or using archival resources. So I think that's probably been the strongest link. I see myself in a continuum that's existed for a really long time of just different ways to share information.
What are some of the projects that you're working on right now that you're super excited about?
Well, there's a couple. So at Case Western, we're in the middle of planning a digital scholarship colloquium for the fall. We have it timed to just before Election Day, so it's going to be November 1st and 2nd, and the theme is the digital and democracy. So our call for papers, it was asking people to engage about the ways that people use digital tools to either uphold or upend democracy. And we've seen a lot of that, right? I mean, we've
definitely.
This just this year alone, I feel like just in the 6 months alone, I mean, we've gone from one thing to another, Cambridge Analytica to, Google employees stepping down over defense contracts, or also seeing on the flip side the ways that people are using digital tools and apps to, for instance, raise money for bail, to bail out women of color on Mother's Day from jail. So people are definitely, and I think it goes back to this idea of neutrality. Some people will think that, tech is neutral. It's just code and it's just hardware. But no, there are people actually behind creating those codes and creating that hardware. And they design it according to their own biases. So that's what I think is really fascinating and also horrifying about how we use technology. So I'm really excited. We closed the submissions and some really, really incredible ones have come in. So really, really looking forward to that. And then we have a fellowship program through our Center for Digital Scholarship. And last year we were working with some researchers who were doing they had gotten a huge grant from, I believe, the Justice Department to study backlog rape kits here in Cuyahoga County. So they then received a fellowship from us, and they worked with our GIS librarian to create a series of maps that visualized where these assaults had taken place. And they had something like 20 years worth of data. What was really exciting to me was that we were then able to connect them to archival resources. In our case, very specifically, the redlining maps of the earlier 20th century. So they were then able to see for themselves. And it was really I think exciting, but also deeply impactful to see these researchers connecting what they thought was relatively contemporary data to something that had happened years and years ago, and really connecting some of those patterns of assault here on the east side of the city directly back to redlining and everything that spouted from that. So they've continued on with that work. Some of our librarians are working with them. They're going to do a workshop at a local tech hub here in the city that does a lot of outreach with communities on the east side of Cleveland to give this workshop about how to use GIS tools and then the implications of visualizing that type of data. I think it's the work they're doing is so awesome. I feel so fortunate that the library has been able to partner with them. And it's also what I think, or what I hope, is the future of librarianship or digital scholarship, that it is absolutely responsive and responsible to the communities around it. I suppose my bigger vision of digital scholarship is basically using it to get research in the hands of people who will be the most affected by it. So, especially if you're at a university located in a city, and it's a university that perhaps has researchers who are doing a great deal of local research, the idea that we could help be a conduit in some way to getting that information in the hands of the communities who could be affected by that research through policy or planning or some other thing, because that research is used for those things. Politicians will use it. Policymakers will use that research to determine one thing or another. So if people have access, the idea that then they could use that to advocate maybe for things that they need, or advocate for some type of positive impact or outcome. That's what I hope that digital scholarship and librarianship in general can be moving toward.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to ask guests, which really gets at the heart of why you do what you do. And that's that question of the world that you're working towards, essentially what all of this kind of adds up to for you. So it's a big question, but it's my favorite question because I think it can be scary for some people, but I also think it's one that we don't get asked enough and we don't get enough chances to answer. We're often very focused on what's bad, right? And fixing what's bad. And that's super important work. But, as we know, we also are working towards something. So I'll ask you, what is that world that you're working towards? What kind of world do you want?
That is a heady question. I want a world where everyone is included in every aspect of it. I want a world in which, if we in the library are putting up digital exhibits online, that they're fully accessible to people with disabilities, and that our buildings themselves are accessible to people from all walks of life. I want a world in which people can use this information. We talk sometimes about this idea of liberatory work, liberatory archives or liberatory librarianship, or maybe we're getting documents to people on the low, kind of like Polyphus White was talking about. So I want a world in which that information is just there. It's not behind a paywall, and that we're actively interrogating what's there all the time, that everybody has the tools that they need to actively interrogate the information at hand. So that means that our schools are good and that they're open to everybody, that it's, not cost prohibitive to go to college if you're not, super wealthy. I want a world that is equal and open and, quite honestly, loving. I might have said that at a library conference I attended one time. They asked everybody to stand up and say what they were motivated by. And I said, quite frankly, I am motivated by love. And I was like, I hope it doesn't sound corny. I don't think love is corny, but I feel like that's that is the thing that's really sustained us over a long period of time. Nothing else has allowed us to sustain and grow and thrive or fight the way that love does. So, if what we're doing in the library space or in the archives can contribute to that in any way, I want to be a part of that and have that be a part of this world. I think that we're trying to work toward. Well, that's a great question.
That's a great answer.
That's really challenging.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Stacie, and sharing the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you so much for having me, Cathy. This was wonderful.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Christopher Prasad, Rebecca Reynolds, Michelle Velasquez-Potts, and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects we discussed on the show.